Non-profit organizations. We have seen that the role of profit-seeking businesses is better understood when they are recognized as profit and loss businesses, with all the pressures and incentives created by these dual potentialities, which force these enterprises to respond to feedback from those who use their goods or services, as well as feedback from those who invested the capital that made the business possible, and whose continuing investments are necessary for its continued existence and prosperity. By the same token, what are called non-profit organizations can be better understood when they are seen as institutions which are insulated, to varying degrees, from a need to respond to feedback from those who use their goods and services, or those whose money enabled them to be founded and to continue operating. The tendency of those who run any organization, whether profit-seeking or non-profit, military, religious, educational, or other, is to use the resources of the organization to benefit themselves in one way or another, even at the expense of the ostensible goals of the organization. How far this tendency can go can be limited by powerful outside interests on which the organization depends for its existence, such as investors who will either get a satisfactory return on their investment or take their money elsewhere, and customers who will either get a product or service that they want at a price they are willing to pay, or likewise take their money elsewhere. These outside interests are not as decisive in the case of non-profit organizations. This does not mean that non-profit organizations have unlimited money, or that they do not need to worry about spending more than they take in. It does mean, however, that with whatever money they do have, non-profit organizations are under very little pressure to achieve their institutional goals to the maximum extent possible with the resources at their disposal. Those who supply those resources include the general public, who cannot closely monitor what happens to their donations, and neither can those whose money provided the endowments which help finance non-profit institutions. Much, or sometimes most, of those endowments were left by people who are now dead and so cannot monitor at all. Non-profit organizations have additional sources of income, including fees from those who use their services, such as visitors to museums and audiences for symphony orchestras. These fees are, in fact, the main source of the more than $2 trillion in revenue received annually by non-profit organizations in the United States. However, these fees do not cover the full costs of the goods and services being supplied. In other words, the recipients are receiving goods and services which cost more to produce than these recipients are paying, and some are receiving them free. Such subsidized beneficiaries cannot exert the same kind of influence or pressure on a non-profit organization that can be exerted by the customers of a profit and loss business, since these latter customers are paying the full cost of everything they get, and will continue to do so only when they find what they receive to be worth what it costs them, compared to what they can get for the same money elsewhere. A non-profit organization's goods or services may be worth what it costs the recipients, sometimes nothing, without being worth what it costs to produce. In other words, while an enterprise constrained by profit and loss considerations cannot continue to use resources which have a greater value in alternative uses elsewhere in the economy, a non-profit organization can, since it need not recover the full costs of the resources it uses from the recipients of the goods and services it provides. Where non-profit organizations are making grants of money, the recipients of that money are in no position to influence the way the non-profit organization operates, as customers of profit-seeking organizations can and do. In the case of non-profit organizations that serve as intermediaries in the transfer of human organs, such as livers and kidneys donated to be transplanted to ill patients, these non-profit organizations can impose arbitrary rules, which neither doctors nor patients are in much position to challenge. In general, those who run non-profit organizations are in a position vis-à-vis those who use their goods and services very similar to that of a landlord during a shortage of housing. There is a surplus of applicants. Under these conditions, neither the desires of the current users of the nonprofit organization's goods and services, nor the original desires of those who supplied their endowments in the past have the kind of leverage that both customers and investors have on a profit-seeking enterprise. Those individuals who happen to be in charge of a nonprofit institution at a given time can substitute their own goals for the institution's ostensible goals, or the goals of their founders. It has been said, for example, that Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller would turn over in their graves if they knew what kinds of things are being financed today by the foundations which bear their names. While that is ultimately unknowable, what is known is that Henry Ford II resigned from the board of the Ford Foundation in protest against what the foundation was doing with the money left by his grandfather. More generally, it is now widely recognized how difficult it is to establish a foundation to serve a given purpose and expect it to stick to that purpose after the money has been contributed, and especially after the original donors are dead. Much money can be dissipated in creating luxurious surroundings in the organization's workplace, or arranging showy conferences in posh hotels and resorts, held in upscale locations around the country or overseas. The aims of the organization can be bent to the aims of its current officials, or to decisions and activities that will gain them public visibility and applause. Whether or not any of this serves the original purpose for which the nonprofit organization was founded, or even its current ostensible purpose. British writer Peter Hitchens observed that the government-established Church of England was more and more being run for the benefit of its own employees, rather than for the benefit of churchgoers or the country. Adam Smith made similar charges against endowed universities in the 18th century. Smith pointed out how academics running colleges and universities financed by endowments can run them in self-serving ways, being very indulgent to one another, so that each academic would consent that his neighbor may neglect his duty, provided he himself is allowed to neglect his own. Widespread complaints today that professors neglect teaching in favor of research, and sometimes neglect both in favor of leisure or other activities, suggests that the underlying principle has not changed much in more than 200 years. Tenure guaranteeing lifetime appointments is common in nonprofit colleges and universities, but is virtually unknown in businesses that must meet the competition of the marketplace, including profit-seeking educational institutions such as the University of Phoenix. Academic institutions, hospitals, and foundations are usually nonprofit organizations in the United States. However, nonprofit institutions cover a wide range of endeavors, and can also engage in activities normally engaged in by profit-seeking enterprises, such as selling sun-kissed oranges or publishing the Smithsonian Magazine. In whatever activities they engage, nonprofit organizations are not under the same pressure to get the most bang for the buck, as are enterprises in which profit and loss determine their survival. This affects efficiency, not only in the narrow financial sense, but also in the broader sense of achieving the avowed purposes of institutions. Colleges and universities, for example, can become disseminators of particular ideological views that happen to be in vogue, political correctness, and restrictors of alternative views, even though the goals of education might be better served by exposing students to a wider range of contrasting and contending ideas. Footnote: John Stuart Mill pointed this out in his essay On Liberty in 1859. He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that, nor is it enough that he should hear the arguments of adversaries from his own teachers, presented as they state them and accompanied by what they offer as refutations. That is not the way to do justice to the arguments, or to bring them into real contact with his own mind. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them, who defend them in earnest, and do their very utmost for them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. End footnote. Employment policies of nonprofit organizations have more latitude than those of enterprises which operate in the hope of profit and under the threat of losses. Before World War II, hospitals were among the most racially discriminatory of American employers, even though their avowed purposes would have been better served by hiring the best qualified doctors, even when those doctors happened to be black or Jewish. Nonprofit foundations were also among the most racially discriminatory institutions at that time. The same was true of the nonprofit academic world, where the first black professor did not receive tenure at a major university until 1948. Yet there were hundreds of black chemists working for profit-seeking chemical companies years before blacks were hired to teach chemistry at nonprofit colleges. Similarly, both black and Jewish doctors had flourishing private practices long before they could practice medicine in many nonprofit hospitals. Regardless of the purposes for which money has been donated to the nonprofit organizations, it is spent at the discretion of people who can use it for their own perks, prejudices, or politics. The performances of nonprofit organizations shed light on the role of profit when it comes to efficiency. If those who conceive of profit as simply an unnecessary charge added on to the cost of production of goods and services are correct, then nonprofit organizations should be able to produce those goods and services at a lower cost and sell them at a lower price. Over the years, this should lead to nonprofit enterprises taking away the customers of profit-seeking enterprises and increasingly replacing them in the economy. Not only have nonprofit organizations not usually taken away the customers of profit-seeking enterprises, increasingly the direct opposite has happened. Nonprofit organizations have seen more and more of their own economic activities taken over by profit-seeking businesses. Colleges and universities are just one example. Over the years, more and more activities once run by nonprofit academic institutions themselves, college bookstores, dining halls, and other auxiliary services, have been increasingly turned over to profit-seeking businesses that can do the job cheaper or better or both. As the Chronicle of Higher Education reported, Follett runs the Stanford bookstore, Aramark prepares the meals at Yale University, and Barnes & Noble manages the Harvard Coop. The nation's most prestigious universities, and many others in academy, increasingly contract out portions of their campus operations. According to the Chronicle of Higher Education, money is the number one reason that colleges contract out an operation. In other words, commercial businesses not only run such services at lower costs, they make enough profit to pay the colleges more than these nonprofit organizations could make from the same operations on their own campuses. For example, the University of South Carolina rarely netted as much as $100,000 per year from its college bookstore, but Barnes & Noble paid them $500,000 a year to run the same bookstore. That implies that Barnes & Noble must have made even more money in order to pay the University of South Carolina more than the university ever made for itself from the same bookstore. Sometimes the reason many campus operations are more profitable under commercial business management is that profit-seeking enterprises reduce such waste as hiring year-round employees for highly seasonal businesses, like college bookstores, where large sales of textbooks are concentrated at the beginning of each academic term. Other reasons include more experience at marketing. At the University of Georgia's bookstore, for example, 70% of the books were stored in inventory when the university ran its own bookstore, but after Follett took over, 70% of the books were put on display, where they were more likely to be bought. In the Middle East, the first kibbutz was founded in 1910 as a non-profit community of individuals providing each other with goods and services and sharing their output on an egalitarian basis. That first kibbutz voted to stop being non-profit and egalitarian in 2007, and by that time so had 61% of the kibbutzim in Israel. One factor in that first kibbutz's decision to change was that young people tended to leave and go live in the market-oriented sector of the economy. In short, even people raised in the philosophy of a non-profit institution like the kibbutz nevertheless voted with their feet to go join the market economy. Despite a tendency in the media to treat non-profit institutions as disinterested sources of information, those non-profit organizations, which depend on continuing current donations from the public, have incentives to be alarmist in order to scare more money out of their donors. For example, one non-profit organization, which regularly issues dire warnings about health risks in the environment, has admitted to not having a single doctor or scientist on its staff. Other nonprofit organizations that are financially dependent on current contributions, as distinguished from large endowments, have similar incentives to alarm their respective constituencies over various social, political, or other issues, and few constraints to confine themselves to accurate or valid bases for those alarms.